Welcome to this brief video series on compassion-focused therapy. This series is about helping us to understand, recognise and be kinder to ourselves about the things that we find difficult, and is based on the work of Paul Gilbert, who is the founder of compassion-focused therapy. The video today is going to be looking at our tricky brains. More specifically, we will be considering a little bit about how our brains work, how as a result we can get caught up in helpful loops, and also thinking about some strategies to better manage these loops. So, as the title suggests, our brains can be tricky. Compassion-focused therapy, or CFT, does draw heavily on the concept of evolution, of explaining how different parts of our brain have developed. It's very much about appreciating that we didn't design our brain to be this way, and because it developed over time, it is imperfect, and different parts of the brain interact in ways that can trip us up. Now, if you're not comfortable with the concept of evolution for any reason, not a problem. Just focus on the sections that consider how the different parts of the brain interact, rather than how they came to be that way. Now, each of our brains will be shaped by our genetics, shaped by our experiences, and so will all be slightly unique. But this video is thinking about the way in which the basic structure of our brain is common to all humans, and we can all be subject to this weird way in which the parts of our brain work together. So, CFT thinks about our brain as having two distinct parts. The survival part of our brain, often referred to as the old brain. So this is a really fast, almost automatic way of our brain just responding in ways to help us to do things to keep ourselves safe, to promote our survival. It's often connected to the oldest parts of evolution, the bits of our brain that maybe we have in common with reptiles and mammals. However, as humans, we've also developed a newer part of the brain that we might call the thinking part of the brain. Now, this is much slower in how it works because it's much more sophisticated and allows us to do all the things that animals can't do. Now, we'll talk through each bit in a moment, but the main reason for making this distinction is the way our survival brain works and the way our thinking brain works don't always interact in helpful ways. So it's this combination that we refer to as the tricky brain. So, thinking first then around what does survival brain do? So this is the bit of our brain that we have in common with other animals, and it's about promoting our survival. It motivates us to find food, to find warmth and shelter. It's thinking about how we might need to compete for the things that we need to survive, to protect ourselves. It's the bit of us that has the fight, flight or freeze response in response to threats. But it's also the bit of our brain that helps us develop how we care for others to promote being able to live in groups. It's also associated with more instinctual emotions, things like anger, anxiety, disgust, sadness and joy that can help gear our behaviour or orient the way what we're doing to promote our basic survival. Now, this is the old part of the brain, the survival part of the brain. We've also talked about the new part of the brain, the thinking brain. This is the bit that makes humans different from animals. So what are we talking about here? This is the newer part of our brain, the neocortex, that gives us the capacity to imagine, to create visual images in our minds, much more sophisticated analysis and reasoning. It's the bit that enables us to consider the future or go back over the past, enables us to do planning and become more aware of ourselves. It also gives us the capacity to do what we call metacognition, which is where we can think about our own thinking. So some really quite advanced and sophisticated thinking skills. So why is the distinction between these two parts of the brain important? Well, we want to understand how our brains work because this is one of the ways when it's not necessarily working in our favour, we can help it to be kinder to ourselves because actually all people have a brain that doesn't necessarily work in helpful ways all of the time. It's also about how we learn to appreciate the processes that might be going on in situations that we find difficult, and over time we can work on that and help to develop more choices about what we can do in the future. So I mentioned earlier about loops. So this is where we think about the two parts of our brain. So let's work through an example. What do we mean by getting caught up in unhelpful loops? Now, I've tried to pick a fairly simple example that hopefully wouldn't be too difficult for anyone, but please do, as you work through this, if it causes any anxiety, please be sure to just pause and look after yourself. But the example here, and hopefully you can relate, is let's say you've just left the house, maybe you're in a bit of a rush, you're getting somewhere, maybe you're a bit anxious about it, or there's a bit of a time pressure. And just as you're moving down the road, far enough away from your house that it's not easy to go back, your brain starts ticking over and you have a thought. And that thought, in this case, is, I think I might have left the cooker on. So let's think about how that might play out in the context of understanding what our survival brain, our old brain, and what our thinking brain, our new brain, does in terms of our experience. So our thinking brain has created the thought, I don't remember if I turned the cooker off. Now, for most people, and this obviously won't be the same for everyone, but just bear with me, it's a worked example. You may find that actually the more you think about it and the less certain you are that you've turned the cooker off, you might start to notice things like your heart rate increasing, your stomach might start to feel a little bit anxious, a bit churny, your muscles might get tense, so you're starting to feel anxious. These old instinctual parts of your survival brain are doing things to your body without you consciously doing those things that start to signal to you, actually this could be a bit of a problem, there is a threat going on here. Now, what that does is starts to create the conditions where your thinking brain, rather than just calmly working through and trying to recall, actually starts to get caught in a little bit of a loop that reinforces itself. So the more we question, feel uncertain, the more we feel anxious, the more our thinking starts to become unhelpful, or at least not soothing. Now, what this also does is then lead to subsequent thoughts. The example here might be what our thinking brain can start to conjure up ideas. What if I have left it on? Now, this is where the thinking part of our brain, with its capacity to imagine, could start to come up with all sorts of scenarios, from things getting spoiled, damage to the property, danger to anyone in the property or neighbouring properties. And actually, the more we're left to come up with these different scenarios, the more it increases our anxiety. So our survival brain is detecting the thoughts, and it doesn't necessarily know whether these things are real or not. So our body is responding to these images as if these things could actually be happening. Now, of course, this whole process is not a relaxing thought. So there's no one that would have this thought and be completely calm and relaxed. But what we're doing here is teasing out what is the connection between our old and new brain, our survival brain and thinking brain, that can actually make difficult situations feel even worse. So the more our anxiety increases, the more we've created conditions that fuel these anxiety-provoking thoughts. So then moving on from that, the next thing might be we start to think about, well, why did I not check it? We might start beating ourselves up, thinking about, well, why was I in such a rush that I didn't just take the time to make sure everything was safely locked up before I left the house? Or why have I left in such a rush that I now haven't got time to go back and just reassure myself that it's fine? So then our survival brain is picking up on this, and we might actually notice that we're starting to feel angry. It's a very self-directed anger, feeling cross with ourselves on top of the anxiety. So this is adding more fuel to the fire of actually feeling our bodies now feel tense, anxious, stressed and agitated, and on it can go. So these loops can create a situation where actually whenever we arrive wherever it was we were going, we're really in quite a stressed, anxious, agitated state. Okay, so then let's think about this. And I have just used that as a simple example, but something that's such an everyday occurrence. This could be happening for us many multiples of times a day, where our mind is just used to getting stuck in loops that feed and fuel stressful and distressing thoughts. So what can we do to help? Well, in the shorter term, it's firstly about starting to notice that we're getting caught up in loops. Now, that can take some practice, and at first we don't notice straight away. We maybe notice with the benefit of hindsight that we were stuck in a bit of a loop. Then it's about being kind of just validating the experience, because we know everyone has a brain that has the capacity to catch us out in this way, to get stuck in loops. Then with practice, we can start to name it. So when we're in the moment, we can be like, oh, okay, so this is a bit of a stressful thought, but now I can start to notice that my brain is starting to hook into it in a way that is adding to the stress of the situation. And be kind. Be kind to ourselves about this. Now, in the moment, we might want to, in the shorter term, think about, well, what can we do to step out of the loop? So it might be how we soothe the survival brain with a comforting activity, or distract the thinking part of our brain with a distraction activity. Now, in compassion-focused therapy, it's all about increasing our compassionate self, our capacity to respond in compassionate ways. But in the short term, we can think about perhaps how to soothe and distract, as long as it's only used as a short-term measure. So thinking then about, in the longer term, what can be helpful? Well, it might be about thinking how we can take the time to note down our loops and look for patterns. Now, some people may like to keep a journal or check in at the end of the day, maybe keep notes on your phone or a mental note, so that you start to recognise your own signature. What is it that you notice? What is it that tends to increase the likelihood that you'll get caught up in a loop? And what is it that you find helpful? The idea being that through compassionate mind training, you start to become more familiar with using our thinking brain in more helpful ways. And of course that takes time, but certainly it's what we would want to aim to work towards. So in the meantime, sending you good wishes, and see you again soon.